Congresswoman Sarah McBride is about a month into her new job representing the state of Delaware in the U.S. House. She was the first freshman Democrat to introduce legislation this term, a sort of wonky bill about closing a loophole in the credit repair industry. And that bill was co-sponsored by a Republican. McBride is determined to work across the aisle, even though some members on the right have made it clear that they will not work with her at all because she is trans. We met the Congresswoman in her office on the Hill.
I think there are some folks here who approach the job with the strategy of a Bravo celebrity, where the easiest way to get airtime is by deciding I'm going to pick a fight with a random member of Congress.
I actually hadn't heard this term before, Bravo celebrity, but basically it means those reality TV stars that you see throwing wine in somebody's face on shows like The Real Housewives. The Congress version of that is something like what happened on X a few weeks ago. McBride had announced that she had been named a deputy whip for policy. Her colleague, Congressman Brandon Gill of Texas, reposted it with a disrespectful remark about her gender identity. And it turns out, if I understand correctly, that his office is next door to this office.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's over there or over there. Over there, okay. The Congresswoman pointed in the direction over her shoulder. But what McBride has noticed is that in order for a beef to happen on reality TV or in Congress, whoever had the proverbial wine thrown in their face has to respond in kind.
And there's drama that then the media can cover between two individuals. It takes two to tango in that instance. And I refuse to participate in that kind of clout chasing. And, it might be an easy way of getting airtime, but it's not why I'm here. And, I'll wave and say hi to people in the hallway. I think people will learn very quickly in this job, if they are new, that, your punchline one day might be the ally you need another day. And that type of behavior ends up siloing people and diminishing their capacity to do work in the long term.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Tuesday, February 11th. Today on the show, my interview with Congresswoman Sarah McBride. We talk about why she is here to make friends and what she thinks the Democratic Party can possibly accomplish during the next 2 years of Trump 2.0. Sarah McBride is on a list the Washington Post just put out. It's called the Post Next 50, 50 people who are shaping our society in 2025. And we started by talking about the feeling of helplessness that a lot of Democrats have, watching the Trump administration's barrage of actions these first few weeks of his presidency. Things are so chaotic and fast-moving, and I do think a lot of liberal Americans see an absence of Democratic leadership, that they're not sure who's in charge, like who is the face or voice who is opposing what is happening in the new administration. And they see Democrats being steamrolled by Trump. Who do you see as the leader of the Democratic Party right now?
Well, I think first off, one of the challenges inevitably of being in the minority across both chambers of Congress and obviously not being in the White House is that there is not a singular voice or a singular person that is able to occupy that leadership position in the same way as a president might.
Of course, yeah.
And that creates a vacuum and also a challenge from a communications perspective of being able to break through. That is just the reality of where we are post-November 2024. Look, I think the leaders of our caucus here in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, and the leader of the Senate Democratic Caucus, Chuck Schumer, are leaders here. And I think they are two critical central voices in the party nationally. But this is going to be a moment where there's soul-searching and recalibration, where existing voices are elevated and new voices come to the forefront. And I think what we have seen is over the last couple of weeks, Democrats in Congress have reflected the sense of urgency, the fear, and the stakes that I think our constituents are feeling with the administration's ongoing assault on congressional power, on individual rights, and on these services and programs that people rely on. I do think that there has to be a degree of expectation setting that there are only so many levers at the disposal of a minority caucus to prevent certain things from happening.
And what are those levers? Because I think there are a lot of questions around, like, what can congressional Democrats actually do in this moment? What can you do more than just saying, look, we oppose what the Trump administration is doing right now?
So I think the first thing, which I think we are seeking to do, is to shine a light and sound the alarm on what the administration is doing, of connecting the dots between, for instance, attacks on USAID and potentially future efforts to gut the Department of Education, Department of Labor, undermine Social Security and Medicare, and really pull back the curtain on what the administration is doing and how all of these actions connect and have a tangible impact on the American people. That's one part. The second part is, in the coming weeks, there will be decision points in Congress where Democrats do have leverage on the continuing resolution that we'll see coming up, potentially on the debt ceiling. There are moments where Democrats can utilize our unity in a moment where there might be disunity among the Republican caucus on some critical issues that will hopefully empower us to rein in some of the excesses.
And you think that there are going to be opportunities to peel off a few Republicans who might vote with you in opposition to some?
I think there are enough Republicans who are so far to the right that even this far-right administration or this far-right leadership in the House won't be able to meet their demands. And therefore, in this fairly evenly divided House, there's an opportunity for Democrats to have leverage in those moments. But there has to be some degree of expectation setting. You know, I can't personally arrest someone despite the demands that people have made. Why aren't you arresting X, Y, or Z person in the administration?
Like who?
That is, I think you can probably guess. There are certain things that an individual member of Congress or a minority caucus in Congress or the Congress period can't do. In some instances, the courts can. In some instances, the power ultimately lies with the people. What we have already seen is when there is enough public pressure and outcry, when an action either is or risks to be too unpopular, this administration pulls back. And so if we sound the alarm, if the public rises up enough, there are instances where this administration recognizes that we still live in a democracy.
I want to ask more about what you hope to achieve during your first term in Congress beyond just, I think, opposing a lot. And it does seem like that's the position that Democrats in Congress largely are in this moment, of pushing back against what Republicans are trying to achieve or what the Trump administration is trying to achieve. But in terms of what your goals are, I mean, you've talked about kitchen table issues being at the heart of your plan for your first term, healthcare, economic issues. What do you think is actually conceivable here of things that you could realistically be able to pass?
Well, there are a number of votes in this chamber that, despite the rancor and division, are unanimous or nearly unanimous. There are issues where we can make progress collectively as Democrats and Republicans working together. I was proud to be the first freshman Democrat to introduce legislation this Congress, and it was bipartisan legislation protecting consumers from predatory practices by so-called credit repair organizations, which in many cases are violating the spirit of federal law by charging large upfront fees on empty promises of an improved credit report and an improved credit score.
As you pointed out, this was a bill that was introduced in a bipartisan way, that you partnered with Representative Young Kim of California, a Republican, to introduce this to the floor. How challenging has it been to start building relationships with Republicans in Congress? And how have you gone about, like, trying to find Republicans to work with you on stuff?
One of the reasons why I decided to run for this position is because I think we have to do a better job of having conversations across disagreement and difference. The only way for a pluralistic democracy to survive is if we can have those conversations across political disagreement and actually work across disagreement. You can't build a majoritarian coalition, particularly in this environment, often a supermajoritarian coalition around a particular idea, if you're not willing to work with people who maybe disagree with you on every other issue but the one before you.
But the question is, are they willing to work with you?
Yes. I mean, I think one, proof's in the pudding. I introduced a bill with a Republican. I've also had the opportunity over the last several weeks to build deeper relationships with Republican colleagues. Obviously, there are a handful of Republican colleagues whose behavior toward me has earned headlines. They are in the minority in that caucus. Most people who are here recognize that their constituents go into work every single day and work with people who look, live, and think differently than they do, and that this is a workplace and we have the same responsibility here. We can disagree fundamentally. We might disagree fundamentally on issues that are very personal for me or very personal for them. Yet we still are colleagues and we still have to work with one another, and that is part of our responsibility. And so in some ways, I will be honest, the behavior of some members of Congress has actually motivated some other Republicans to reach out and build relationships with me. And, there was a picture that posted online the other day of me having a conversation with a very conservative member of the Republican caucus, Representative Tim Burchett, who we don't agree on probably most issues, including issues that are near and dear to my heart. Mm-hmm. But we're friendly to one another, and he's got a killer sense of humor. And, it's important to me to build relationships with folks who have very different perspectives from me, because I will learn from them and hopefully they'll learn from me.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Congresswoman McBride and ask her about her balancing act and when and how she speaks out against the new administration's actions targeting trans people. We'll be right back.
I'm Jessica Contreras, and I'm a reporter at The Washington Post. Every day at The Post, we are trying to make sure that we are holding powerful institutions accountable. For the last 2 years, for me, that has meant looking at child sexual abuse by members of law enforcement all across the country. We identified at least 1,800 police officers who have been arrested for crimes involving child sexual abuse from 2005 through 2022. That number, figuring out that this is happening and figuring out how it's happening, it never would have been possible without the time and resources it takes to do an investigation like this. And when you subscribe to The Washington Post, that's the kind of work that you're supporting. Making sure that powerful institutions are held accountable by the taxpayers who pay for their work. Subscriptions support this work and the people behind it. I'm Jessica Contreras, and I'm one of the people behind The Post.
I want to ask you about an interview that you gave shortly before entering Congress, and this was with David Remnick at The New Yorker, where you talked about your belief that Democrats need to be cautious about moving too far away from the general population on controversial issues, including issues related to the lives of trans people. You said, quote, "This country is still entering into a conversation about trans people. This country is still at a trans 101 spot." And then you went on to use this metaphor that I found really interesting about wanting to keep people within arm's distance, that if you let the public kind of get out of arm's distance, and as you said, quote, "If we lose our grip, we're unable to pull the public with us." Mm-hmm. I want to fast forward to this moment when we started to see the Trump administration launch this wave of executive orders, some of them aimed at the rights of trans people. And for example, like the executive order banning trans women from women's sports. Mm-hmm. And to be clear, what he's doing in this executive order is pretty much in line with where Americans are at right now, according to a New York Times Ipsos poll from just this past January, 79% of people and 2/3 of Democrats believe that trans women should not be allowed to compete in women's sports. So what position does that put you in terms of the decision of weighing whether to speak out against the Trump administration and policies that are harmful to trans people, but are also in line with where the American people are at?
So I think that maintaining proximity to public opinion doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean, it doesn't mean changing your overarching position. It means meeting people where they are. And I think we have to be willing to acknowledge very understandable questions and even concerns that people might have. Whether we personally agree with those concerns or whether we personally agree that those concerns rise to, legislative or presidential action, we have to see those concerns and not treat people as bigots for having concerns that may or may not be rooted in misconceptions or a lack of understanding, or are, in some cases, real concerns. I don't see anyone who's saying, a person announces their gender identity and the very next day they can play on the sports team of their gender identity without any qualification for any age. I don't see anyone seriously saying that. So clearly there is a decision that has to be made about when and where a trans person can participate in sports. And my answer to that is the entities that are best able to grapple with those decisions are not 435 members of Congress, some of whom, like me, have really never played any sports. It's not the President of the United States. It's the individual athletic associations and organizations that best understand their sport and are best able to dive in objectively to the science and the data around competitiveness, fairness, respect, and inclusion, and how to balance those things. I think that is a reasonable position to take, that if you have that conversation, even with the Americans who have concerns, that if you were to have that conversation, most people would come away thinking that that is a reasonable position.
So you are, in fact, opposed to that executive order,
yes,
but because it is taking away the decision-making from some of these sports organizations or entities that you think are better positioned to deal with them.
I think when you have a blanket policy like that, that makes does not distinguish between ages, sports, a person's own individualized journey, a categorical or blanket policy in that circumstance misunderstands and misrepresents the diversity of sport and the diversity in the trans community. And I think more fundamentally, it also raises some serious questions about enforceability. I mean, if you have a blanket ban, it is inviting grown adults, including grown men, who simply suspect that a 6-year-old is trans, to demand invasive questions or even invasive bodily inspections to prevent that young person who may or may not be trans from participating in sports.
Going back to that metaphor about pulling the public and keeping them within arm's distance, how do you make the decision of where the rubber meets the road and where to be very clear about speaking out, or be very clear in calling a view or a person bigoted, or to oppose in a way that doesn't create a space for, well, let's talk about how you feel about this and why you got here?
Well, I think to steal a phrase from the Supreme Court, you know when you see it. I think there is behavior that you can very clearly see is done in bad faith. But again, I'm really just not one for that type of rhetoric. I think others are entitled to utilize that rhetoric. I seek to engage in a politics that assumes best intentions. I won't be fooled. I won't. There are certain people who are committed to not ever listening and learning and growing. And in politics, you got to recognize that there's just some people you're never going to convince of the rightness of your cause, and you've got to triage your time and your energy and your focus. And I will certainly do that. But, I think calling people names, even if it feels viscerally comforting, even if you might feel like it is an accurate term, often distracts from the larger goal of your message being heard and hearts and minds being changed. It often shuts down conversations. And I would like to be right and productive. And I think a lot of times name calling undermines that. I also think that for me, when you move back from the individual actions, for instance, by the Trump administration on trans rights, I think the American people get that, like, even if you have complicated feelings about the specifics of some of those policies, the focus, the prioritization, the just onslaught of actions that are clearly trying to push trans people into the shadows and the margins does not sit well with people. And so, for instance, there was a wave of attacks. I didn't necessarily speak out on every attack, but I did speak out about the collection of attacks that we're seeing. And I name-checked a number of the policies.
For example, the ban on providing gender care for minors, which had more recently been put on pause. But that was something.
And the trans troop ban. And what I did is I spoke out about, over the course of 2 weeks, the plethora of attacks that we've seen. But, I have a job to do, just as every member of Congress has a job to do. And I can't, and I said this during the course of the campaign, I can't tweet out or put out a statement, nor should I, every single time that there is an anti-trans action being done. There are great organizations that are on the front lines. I have to make sure that I'm working on all of the issues that matter. And when I have to defend my trans constituents, I will, but I'm there for all of my constituents. And that means working on and spending time on all of the issues and not becoming a, LGBTQ advocacy organization with a House office.
Mm-hmm. Coming back to one of the issues that you mentioned earlier that I think is top of mind for a lot of people right now, we're at this moment where it seems like there are efforts to dismantle at least major parts of the federal government. Yeah. We have federal workers who are very fearful of losing their jobs, federal contractors who have already lost their jobs. Being from close by here in Delaware, my understanding is that you have at least a few thousand constituents who are in that category. What is your message to these people right now? And how do you think this is all going to play out? Like how is this going to end?
So first off, my message to any public servant who is either seeing their job eliminated or fears that their job will be eliminated first is to thank them for their service and their work on behalf of this government, and to say that there are members of Congress, there are organizations, there are attorneys general across this country who are fighting every single day to protect their jobs and their benefits and their well-being. I am cautiously optimistic that a number of these attacks will be met with, as we are already seeing, a response from the judiciary that prevents a fundamental erosion of the rights of workers individually in the federal government and the workforce writ large that my constituents broadly rely on for the services and programs that they need to live and to thrive. I think we also have to, in this fight, connect the dots. I think for a lot of folks who don't work for the federal government, the concept of the federal workforce can feel abstract. But we have to make clear that this effort to gut the federal workforce is part of a larger effort to prove that government can't work by making it not work. If you fire people who are doing the work of the federal government, if you are firing people who are saving lives, who are staffing our VA hospitals, who are in our Social Security office, who are in the Department of Education protecting the individual civil rights or dispensing grants to states, if you fire those people, those things either grind to a halt or are not as efficiently and effectively dispersed and dispensed with. And that will have real consequences for people.
But I think that there's a sense that the outcry in reaction to some of this isn't completely there. And I mean, I think I see it one way being in DC and, having more people around me who are connected to the federal government. But that they're, in terms of who is opposing or who is trying to stand up to Trump administration efforts right now, that there is a sense that, yes, the judiciary in some cases and federal judges are stepping in to put things on pause or to stop things from playing out, at least right now, but that we're not seeing the Women's March. We're not seeing people taking to the streets in response to what they're seeing so far. And I'm sure you have the sense from people around you, the way that I do, people say, look, I'm burnt out. I just can't pay attention anymore. I just, that like, I don't have it in me to, be thinking about what the government is doing the same way that maybe I was in 2016. Do you think that we're just seeing like a different type of resistance now and that it's normal and appropriate that like people are engaging with this in a different way and in some ways less? Or is this like a failure to really stand up in this moment when we are seeing some pretty major things happening to the government?
I think that there was an understandable feeling of being demoralized by Democratic voters after the November election because unlike 2016, we didn't win the popular vote. And I think that took a lot of the wind out of a lot of people's sails. I do think over the last few weeks, we have seen a shift in the public's appetite for action, whether it's protests, whether it's the unprecedented number of calls my and other offices are getting about these issues. I think people have quickly tuned back in and gotten a burst of energy because they're seeing the scale of the attacks. They're seeing Project 2025 be put into action. And I think it's mobilizing people. And I think you will see people take to the streets. I think you will see direct action. I think you will see people write to their members. I think you will see people turn out to vote. But it's going to take that for us to effectively respond because the sad reality is that Democrats did not win the last election. And there are consequences to that result that we have to grapple with. And that means getting creative. It means figuring out how to reach people in a better way. But that is the reality that we're in. And I wish that there was a magic wand that folks could wave and stop the consequences of these actions. But that magic wand does not exist. And the closest thing that we have to that is ultimately our voice for the next 2 years and our vote now. And we've got a special election in Delaware coming up and ultimately, obviously, in November. And I know people don't want to hear go vote in 2 years, but that is going to be part of the solution. We have to level set with people.
Congresswoman McBride, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Representative Sarah McBride is a Democrat from Delaware. She was also interviewed for this new project, Post Next 50. It's a series of profiles of the people shaping our society in 2025. The list includes rising stars in politics, entertainment, sports, culture, business, and tech. We'll put a link in our show notes so you can check it out. That's it for today's episode of Post Reports. Thanks for listening. This episode was produced by Emma Talkoff. It was edited by Maggie Penman and mixed by Sam Baer. Thank you also to Lucas Trevor. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.